Hi. So, I'm in the car again. Um, I'm actually in a Walmart parking lot, which is a little kind of ghetto. Make a video in a Walmart parking lot in your car, but it is what it is. So today, I was just gonna read an excerpt from one of my most recent romance novels, which I kind of also recently did a little video about the inspiration of. It is called The Bake Off, and it is about it's an enemies to lovers story. It's about two chefs who are both from a small town in Alabama, and they're kind of like competitors. Um, like Holly is one chef, and she's really shy, and she owns a bakery that's not doing too well. And then there's Dean, who he also owns a bakery, but he's really handsome and popular, and like of in high school he was like a football star. So in their small town, everybody knows Dean, and everybody goes to his bakery. So anyway, when Dean and Holly both get a chance to go on this really huge um, cooking competition reality show, they both sign up for it, or are signed up for it in Holly's case, and they're both accepted. So that means they're going to be competing against each other on national television, on like the most popular show, that reality show ever. And it's good because if either of them wins, they'll win like $1 million. And Holly really needs that. Dean also needs it too. But the thing is, Holly has a massive crush on Dean. Like, she really, really, really likes him. She always has. So yeah, that just kind of makes things complicated for her. I was gonna read, I think I may have already read part of the prologue in another video, but I can't really remember. So I'm gonna read it again, I guess. And then if you all don't get sick of me, I'll read chapter 1 or part of it. We'll see how my voice holds up. But anyway, this book, I'll start with the dedication page. It says, "This book is dedicated to one of the kindest souls this world has ever known, Jada." Jada is one of my close friends. She is like really one of the sweetest people I've ever known in my entire life. I don't think though that she had time to read this book yet. She's so sweet. She usually reads all of my books, but she's just really busy lately. So I don't think she knows I dedicated this book to her. But anyway, she's very, very loved. Okay, the prologue. When the recess bell rang at Lee Elementary School, hordes of children did not pour out of the building like unbridled waters. As one of the best public education institutions in High Valley, Alabama, Lee Elementary's faculty took pride in the disciplined and well-groomed appearance of their young scholars. Each of the school's students were shining examples of orderliness and decorum, each except for Holly Schmidt. While her classmates quietly walked along in twos, headed for the play yard's swing sets, slides, and sandbox, 5-year-old Holly ambled along alone. She held a small white box as she carefully made her way to the class vegetable garden. Her dark, curly hair was as unruly as her clothes were wrinkled and spotted with stains. Among her neatly dressed classmates, Holly stood out as different. One of the two teachers tasked with monitoring the kindergarten recess shift eyed the little girl with wary curiosity. "It's like watching my Pomeranian sashay out of the kitchen with a mouthful of something that I just know isn't dog food," Mrs. Layton said in a disapproving tone. "Lord knows what's in that box." Mrs. Layton stood tall in her crisp white blouse and khaki slacks beside Miss Hunt, a fellow kindergarten teacher. The two observed the children from the schoolyard's shaded porch. Dutiful as always, Mrs. Layton had been scanning the vicinity, ensuring that each child was walking with a partner as prescribed by school rules. That's when her gaze stopped on Holly. The little girl walked without a partner, clutching a mysterious box. Mrs. Layton sighed. Why does that child never follow rules? What's wrong with her? Oh, Holly? Miss Hunt chuckled and reached into the pocket of her sundress to retrieve a stick of gum. I gave her permission to walk to recess without a partner. She's a sweet kid. But it's always something with her, Mrs. Layton huffed. She glanced at Miss Hunt. Gum isn't allowed. Are you chewing gum? You can either experience the scent of this minty fresh gum for the next 15 minutes or the pleasure of my stress-induced halitosis. Miss Hunt smiled, and without waiting for a reply, she popped the gum into her mouth. Mrs. Layton scoffed with a touch of disapproval, but chose to allow the infraction. After all, she had a keen sense of smell, and Miss Hunt was telling the truth about her halitosis. It was quite unpleasant. As she returned her attention to the schoolyard, she couldn't help but focus on the one glaring blunder in the vicinity, little Holly. Do you know what's in the box? Mrs. Layton asked with a frown. Cupcakes, Miss Hunt replied. Holly may not say more than 2 words a day, but she sure as heck makes up for it by baking. Mrs. Layton crossed her arms. I wouldn't trust a 5-year-old's baking prowess, not to mention the child's likely unsanitary living conditions. Look at how her mother sends her to school. Miss Hunt gave her colleague a sidelong look. She's a deaf single mother struggling to raise a hearing kid, and the woman works 3 jobs. Give her a break. There's no other family in the picture? Mrs. Layton asked. Usually grandparents will step in to help. Miss Hunt shook her head. Not that I know of. And to Holly's defense, her cupcakes are delicious. She bought me 2 yesterday. Maple pumpkin with cinnamon cream cheese frosting. They were incredible. Mrs. Layton brought a hand up to her perfectly coiffed pompadour and smoothed it as she said, I can't promise to refrain from saying I told you so when you come down with a horrible viral infection. Miss Hunt chuckled. Holly brings our class cookies or cupcakes at least twice a week. No one's gotten sick yet. Emphasis on yet, Mrs. Layton said with a sniff. Miss Hunt rolled her eyes, but said nothing. Mrs. Layton looked around before quietly adding, You know, she's Jewish, part Mexican, too. The other teacher stopped chewing her gum and turned to Mrs. Layton in shock. What does that have to do with anything? Well, it's not exactly a promising heritage, Mrs. Layton said. Mrs. Layton, Miss Hunt hissed, you cannot speak that way around me. That kind of talk is disgustingly prejudiced. I won't tolerate it. Both women were suddenly red. Mrs. Hunt's change in hue was due to horror. Mrs. Layton became the color of an apple thanks to embarrassment. I'm only saying what everyone thinks, Mrs. Layton retorted. That's enough, Miss Hunt snapped. Silently fuming, she added, and not that it even matters, but Holly and her mother are not Mexican. They're Cuban. You'd think an educator would realize that not every person of Hispanic heritage is Mexican. Wishing she'd kept her thoughts to herself, Mrs. Hunt huffed. Uncomfortable silence drifted between the 2 women. Without a word, the teachers watched Holly navigate her way over the roots of a large oak tree. She walked with caution as she clasped the small white box and approached the garden. As she got closer to the strategically placed cucumbers and peppers her class planted weeks ago, Holly paused in stride. She took in the sight of the boy she'd made the cupcakes for, and her heart twitched with a sort of hiccup. 6-year-old Dean Quinn was armed with a large wicker basket as he picked cucumbers from the garden. He had floppy brown hair, big blue eyes, and a smile that invited Holly to grin right along with him. She took a deep breath and tried to be brave. Hi, Holly said, taking another step forward. Dean looked up and smiled. Hey, Holly. His gaze went to the box in her hands. Is that for the garden? She shook her head. A sudden wave of shyness had rendered her speechless. Without a word, she opened the box, took out one of the peanut butter chocolate cupcakes, and offered it to Dean with an outstretched hand. He glanced at the cupcake before looking at Holly. That's for me? He asked. She nodded, and not for the first time, wished he knew sign language. It would be so much easier to have a conversation with him that way. Thanks, he grinned and took the cupcake. Relieved, she lifted a hand to sign, "You're welcome," and then remembered she was supposed to talk. "Welcome," Holly quietly replied, lowering her hand. Excuse me. She started to turn away and stopped as she realized she'd forgotten to give him the other cupcake in the box. Overcome by nerves, Holly set the box on the ground, whispered, "This one's for you too," and ran away as quickly as possible. "Thanks, Holly," Dean called after her. As he watched her run away, he briefly wondered why she was leaving instead of sharing the cupcake with him. His thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a large brown stain on the hem of Holly's white dress. Frowning, Dean took a bite of the cupcake and considered this. Her clothes always looked dirty. Mom never lets me go to school in dirty clothes, not even wrinkled clothes, he thought. But as the cupcake's smooth and decadent sweetness hit his taste buds, Dean's mind wandered in a much more pleasant direction. "Wow," he whispered with his mouth full. He took another bite and looked down at the cupcake in wonder. It was the best thing he'd ever tasted. "Oh, cupcakes!" a familiar voice screeched from behind him. Dean turned around. Beth Rhymes and her friends were approaching. Beth was between the other two girls, Carly and Selena, on her left and right, respectively. Beth pointed to the untouched cupcake that was still in the box. "I want that one. Can I have it?" Dean had no desire to share, but Beth was his friend, and she was pretty. He'd already decided that one day he would marry her, so he shrugged and pretended not to care. "Yeah." Beth sauntered to the box, ignoring Carly and Selena as they whined that they wanted a cupcake too. Tuning them out, she addressed Dean. "Where'd you get this?" "Holly," he replied as he finished the last bite. "Ugly Holly Schmidt? Gross." Beth rolled her eyes and put one of her hands on her hip. "I guess her desserts are okay, but her clothes are terrible." Dean glanced at Beth, silently agreeing with her, yet unwilling to say so out loud. Holly didn't say much, but she seemed nice. She smiled a lot. Even better, she always brought their class cookies and cupcakes. "Who cares?" he said, and returned his attention to the garden. He searched for another cucumber to harvest while Beth sat down beside him. His eyes narrowed as she quietly said, "I dare you to get Holly in trouble." Carly and Selena laughed. "Do it, Dean," Carly urged. "Yeah, Dean, do it," Selena echoed. Filled with uncertainty, he glanced at the two girls before returning his attention to Beth. She was his friend, but he also liked Holly. Besides, Holly had just given him the best cupcake he'd ever eaten. "I don't know," Dean said. "I don't think I want to." "Why not?" Beth frowned. "It'll be easy because she loves you. She'll do anything you tell her." "Holly loves me?" Dean repeated, confused. Selena made kissing noises and Carly laughed. "That's not true." Dean blushed and shook his head. "Holly doesn't love me. She hardly talks to me." Beth smiled and leaned closer to Dean as she said, "She does. I can prove it. Go up to her and tell her to punch you in the stomach and make sure the teachers are watching. If she does it, that means she loves you." Bewildered, Dean stared at Beth before repeating her strange instructions. "If Holly punches me, that means she loves me?" Beth nodded. "When people are in love with you, they do whatever you tell them." Carly said, "He won't do it. He's too scared." Dean flinched. His older brothers always picked on him for being a scared little runt. He hated it when they said that. Beth smiled at Dean. "You're not a scaredy cat, are you?" "No," Dean retorted, setting the basket of cucumbers down in the dirt with a thud. Beth narrowed her eyes and said, "Prove it. Go make ugly Holly Schmidt punch you. Don't be a chicken." Dean's fists clenched as annoyance flared in his gut. "I'm not scared." With this, he marched to the playground and looked around for Holly. Within seconds, he spotted her on the swing set near the schoolyard's fence. She was all by herself. "Holly," he called as he ran towards her. Excuse me. She looked up, instantly brightening at the sight of him. She hadn't been swinging as much as she'd been sitting on the swing, thinking about what she wanted to bake with her mom later that evening. She just decided on a German chocolate cake when Dean ran her way, shouting her name. Holly's heart skipped a beat, and she wondered if he was going to tell her how much he liked the cupcakes. Dean stopped running once he was right in front of her. Standing tall, he looked her in the eye and said, "Holly, can you punch me in the stomach?" She blinked back at him in confusion. "Punch you?" He smiled. "Yeah, I really want you to. Right in the stomach. Please?" Her eyes were wide and her mind was clouded with doubts, but Dean's pleasant smile and sprinkle of a sweetened "please" swiftly erased her hesitation. Holly stood, balled her small hand into a fist, and slammed it into Dean's gut. Taken by surprise, he staggered backwards, tripped over his feet, and fell. Within seconds, Mrs. Layton and Miss Hunt were with the two children. Miss Hunt helped Dean to his feet and asked him if he was all right. Mrs. Layton grabbed one of Holly's arms and shouted, "You're going to the principal's office right this minute, young lady." "But he told me to," Holly tried to explain. "You're a violent rule breaker, and there's no place here for children like you," Mrs. Layton said as she pulled Holly along. As Holly stared up at the teacher, her confusion regarding the situation dissipated, and she began to understand what Mrs. Layton was really saying. Holly was an outsider at Lee Elementary, just like she was an outsider everywhere. She didn't fit in. "What's going to become of you, Holly? If you can't follow rules like everyone else, what will become of you?" Mrs. Layton exclaimed as she gave the little girl a sharp look. "I'll just bake at home with Mommy," Holly whispered. "What?" Mrs. Layton frowned and slowed in stride. "Nothing," Holly quickly replied, shaking her head. She knew Mrs. Layton wouldn't understand. The only time Holly felt like she belonged was when she and her mother were at home, in their kitchen, baking their favorite desserts. When Holly was baking, the rules were easy. They made sense. When she and her mom followed them, they created beautiful desserts that made people happy. "God help me," Mrs. Layton snorted and rolled her eyes. "Holly, there's more to life than baking. Now come on, let's get you to the principal's office." There's more to life than baking? As Holly turned the teacher's words over in her mind, dread filled her gut. She desperately hoped Mrs. Layton was wrong. Baking desserts with her mother had become the shining centerpiece of her life, and she didn't ever want that to change. Chapter 1, Holly, February 5th. I hated elementary school, and right now I'm getting flashbacks. They aren't pleasant. I'm remembering my first school picture day. It was over 2 decades ago at Lee Elementary School. I was a nervous wreck. I knew my secondhand clothes weren't as nice as my classmates. The thought of being photographed in one of the nearly unsalvageable outfits for a school picture was horrifying. When it was time to take the picture, I was so nervous I was trembling. The photographer kept telling me to loosen up, and he was kind enough to take several pictures in hopes of finding at least one decent shot in the bunch. All 5 images were terrible, and it had nothing to do with his skill as a photographer. The one that ended up in the school yearbook featured 5-year-old Holly Schmidt, unsmiling and looking like a scared armadillo staring into the high beams of a Mack truck. Now I stand in front of my bakery, sweeter, with my arms crossed over my chef's jacket and a tense smile on my lips. "Holly, you look horrible. Loosen up," my friend Miguel Diaz says as he lowers his phone. "What's with that weird serial killer smile? Why are you doing that? Stop." Clearly, not much has changed since my scared armadillo days. "Okay, ditching the serial killer vibe," I say, an attempt to widen my smile. Just then, an 18-wheeler honks as it passes the strip mall Sweeter is situated in. I flinch, startled by the noise. "You jumped right when I took it," Miguel snaps. "No jumping." "Sorry," I say before taking a deep breath and trying to resurrect my smile. Who knew smiling could be so difficult? "Let's try this," Miguel shouts. "Close your eyes, and I'm going to count. When I get to 3, open them." "Okay," I agree, closing my eyes. Miguel initiates the countdown, and when I open my eyes on 3, he takes the photo. That one was less horrific. In any case, I can't take this anymore. We're done, he says, shaking his head as he puts his phone away. Thank God you're better in the kitchen than you are in front of a camera. Okay, I'm going to stop there because my voice is wearing out. So yeah, that was an excerpt from the Bake Off. And as you can see, like the prologue was written in third person to give you like a bird's eye view, I guess you could say, of Holly's life when she was a little kid. But the rest of the story, all of the chapters at least, are written in first person from Holly's and Dean's perspectives. Like the first chapter is Holly's perspective, the second chapter is Dean's, and so forth. And then the epilogue is also written in third person to give you a bird's eye view of the end of the story. All right, well, if you made it through this another one of my long-winded videos, I applaud you and thank you so much. You are a wonderful person. All right, that's all. I'm tired and I gotta go shopping in Walmart. Bye.